folks. I think we're going to get started. Welcome to Brewing Operations, the importance of trace minerals in brewing with Michael. Rich, with over 30 years in the brewing industry, is a consultant at I Make Beer LLC and works with IDD Process and Packaging. His passion for brewing began with a homebrew recipe that landed him a job at a local brewery in 1992. Since then, he's honed his craft and program at the Siegel Institute and European brewing schools and worked at award-winning breweries of all sizes. Rich is active in the NBAA and shares his knowledge by teaching brewing at 2 SUNY colleges. Recently, he and his wife Stacy have started a farm distillery called Second Experience. And we're very lucky to have Rich here. He's probably as close as we get to a venerated brewer in New York State. So please a round of applause for our speaker.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about trace minerals in beer and brewing and what happens to them and what they do for us. Kind of touching around water chemistry, pH and all that. I will take any questions you have on that, so feel free to raise your hand and ask what this means at any time. So, good start. So as brewers, we make wort. We really rely on our yeast to make wort into beer. There's a lot of trace minerals that come into play for us as brewers: calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron, and copper. They're all important in trace amounts. They're very helpful to get the fermentation process going. The happy yeast make good beer. A few exceptions to that. German wheat beer yeast, we stress that eventually the German wheat beer. For the most part, our job is to keep their yeast happy how it is possible. We're talking about some of the trace minerals in brewing and what they do for yeast health and flavor of the beer well. So where do these trace minerals come from? Our water. Our water is the largest ingredient we use in our process. Who here has a current water analysis for their brewery? Who here does not? Ward Labs upstairs does a great job with brewery water testing. There's plenty of really good water quality labs around the country, but it's important to know where your water comes from, and your water can change seasonally. You know, if you're groundwater, well water, even that can change as the water table rises in the fall. So know where it comes from, know when it could change. Know brewery in the central part of the state where we had reservoir water. Reservoir water is great for brewing, generally. The water naturally gets soft in contact with leaves and sticks in the water. Makes for a very neutral water. Well, reservoir goes up and down with time, and eventually the water gets so low that it's no longer a reservoir, there's no contact time. It's basically the slow spot in the stream. So what was great water in the season when the reservoir was full, there's no longer great water in the summertime when it drops. So keep an eye on it and figure out when it can change. Even if you work with a water source that's one of the Great Lakes, they change seasonally, the lakes will turn, and your water will shift as well. So figure that out. You may have to test your water a couple times a year. Figure that out. It's very important. And many municipalities have multiple water sources. Just one brewery I've worked with that was right next to the water plant. And their water source, they couldn't get an answer when things would change. Their water would change from day to day, depending on what supply the town was using. So figure that out, figure out when things change seasonally, and you may have to adjust your water differently. I know I've worked in breweries where our brewers would check our pH for mash and make adjustments on the fly. Period. Recently, a couple of years ago, where we were using groundwater elevated class aquifer, and then New York State did not replenish the canal during COVID. So our water table shifted and our water chemistry changed as a result of that. So we had people from the health department talking to us about beer in general, just hanging out, and talking about the shift in water chemistry. They didn't even notice it. But that's because New York State is diverted water. So pay attention to it. Things shift. Basic water analysis is typically less than $50, and there are many labs that can do the testing. We have one here today that I know will do it. So proper pH is critical for many brewing chemical reactions. Who here is a pH meter? Who here calibrates or checks their pH meter daily? You can buy a gallon of pH buffer and spot check that daily. A gallon of pH buffer will last you at least a year. That's worth doing at least once a week. Make sure your stuff's not shifting, drying out, things like that. And pH meters also need to be stored properly. Don't store it dry. You need proper pH storage solution for that, or at least store it in some sort of buffer so it doesn't dry out But it's worth picking up your pH. We are checking it against a 4 standard. It's closest to your mash. If you see that shift, that's an indication that you need to recalibrate with 4 and 7, or 4, 7, and 10, depending what your meter wants. So as brewers, we treat our water to achieve desired pH in the mash and brewing. We're not really throwing water salts or acids as an ingredient. We're basically trying to get the water to combine with our ingredients to net out what we want. So it's the pH of the mash, the wort, and the finished beer that's important, not the pH of your water. I worked in a large city in upstate New York 25 years ago, 30 years ago. The pH of our water was 9. So we're sitting around one night having a beer. What can we do about that? Our beers come out really good. Just won a GADF gold medal. Obviously, some stuff's going right. But 9, that's pretty rough. So, being young brewers, we took a quick scoop of acid, 1 cup, small amount. The pH of the water dropped to 3. Wow. Well, that water was very, very soft and very neutral. The city kept the pH artificially high to keep lead from leaching out of the pipes. So that water had no buffering capacity. 9 just told us where it was, didn't tell us how easy it was to move it. It turns out that water, to make it good brewing water, the solution was actually just to put grain in it. It was good to go just like that. Even though 9 was our starting number. We put grain in it and our pH would drop right down to the mid-5s, so you're good to go. So basic brewing water chemistry, optimal pH ranges, protein rest, typically on the low end, 5.5 to 5.2. Probably not a lot of people do protein rest these days with their well-modified malt. pH conversion, that's the meat and potatoes, what we do in the mash tun, 5.2 to 5.6. That range gets you some good activity for beta amylase and some good activity for maltose. It's kind of in the middle, so it's a good place to be. Kettle pH, typically you'll see the pH drop with boiling, so you'll see the pH drop 5 to 5.5, 5.2 is pretty typical knockout pH. Beer pH, 4.2 to 4.6 is fairly normal. Sour beers can be much lower than that. Beers that are lower than that, that are not sour beers, are prone to some issues like hop aromas not coming through cleanly. Haze issues, not that anyone cares about haze these days, I said that this morning. And pH above 4, much above 4.6 can lead to shelf stability issues. But there's some great tools we can get as brewers. Yes, one question.
I was just going to ask about brewing. Have they got any easier to use?
Brewing water?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. Martin Brewingard, the guy who wrote that, he's an engineer. So
okay.
You can blame that on him. If you can find, maybe we'll talk about that next year, but if you can crack that, figure that out, that's definitely worth doing. It's a pretty good predictor for it.
Just do a class on the next year, maybe? How to use brewing water?
So next year, when the Brewers Association puts out a request for proposals and ideas, go ahead and submit that. Make a note of that. I think I might have one done already. And that's a pretty good predictor. It's a tool that you can use to get close. The buffering capacity of your malt can vary as well. We find that some of the New York malt that's grown under kind of drought conditions, the pH buffer a little bit lower than expected, but you can get a good starting point and make some fine-tune adjustments from that. So pH has an impact on beer stability. For example, hop aromas are linalool and S-linalool, 2 forms of linalool. Our linalool is 90 times stronger aroma than S-linalool. So obviously, which one do we want? We want the good one. Well, you can dictate what you get in your beer with the pH. So a pH of 4.5, you'll get 96% our linalool. 4.0 will drop off close to 10% of your aroma, just on the minor amount. So getting that right is important. Haze formation, I mentioned haze can be an issue. I worked at a brewery a few years back where we struggled to manage haze. a little bit, in extremely bright, clean yellow beers. Not the consumer stuff, but we were pretty picky about it. When we found that lower pH products, that pH would drop below 4.2, we'd see some haze never get rid of. It's been 8 years trying to make clear beer, and nobody cares anymore. Yeah. We had Carl come and talk to our master brewers group about haze one year, and Carl did haze research at Stroh many years ago. Haze that you and I can't see. Okay, we'll believe you, it was there. We're trying to get, unfiltered hazy IPAs, you can talk about chilies. We'll make yourself a level. So beer has a more rounded flavor between 4.2 and 4.5. That's the writings of Ludwig Narcissus. He suggests that optimal was 4.25 to 4.6. Things much above 4.6 can be stability issues microbiologically. The FDA considers food with a product with pH greater than 4.6 to be low pH food. They start to look at that from a food safety standpoint. Klaus Sastro was one of my instructors at Siebel years ago. He suggested that beer should be 4.3 to 4.5. And beer is prone to oxidation at a higher pH, so everything you do is a compromise. You may get a better aroma presence at a higher pH, but you're also subject to oxidation as well. So everything's a balance. So trace minerals, where do they come from? Raw materials: barley, hops, yeast nutrients, and adjuncts. These are materials we put in our beer. They can carry things with them that will impact our beer. So where do they come from? Raw materials are agricultural products: dirt, pesticides, all the processing and handling equipment, pipes, tanks, copper kettles, non-passive stainless steel. Everybody's heard about passivation these days. If you've got questionable wells in your equipment, you can actually leach iron in your process. Malt roasting. There was a study done a few years ago where a certain malt roaster was using old cast iron drum roasters, and they found that the abrasive ends of the malt would actually pick up iron from that. I know one large brewery disqualified a certain draft maltster from being a supplier because of that. They've since replaced those old brewer roasters. Filtration. Diatomaceous filter powder can be huge source of metals. So when you're shopping for filter powder, it's a little bit better filter powder than you use for your swimming pool. Make sure you're buying beer grade or low soluble iron filter powder. Again, everybody saves the beer grade. Calcium. Calcium is important for mash enzyme stability. 50 parts per million will help stabilize your enzymes. Without enzymes working, you can't convert starch to sugar, so we can't make beer. Yeast flocculation, you need calcium in there for yeast to stick together and settle out. And calcium actually reacts with phosphates in the malt and lowers the mash pH, precipitates as calcium phosphate. So using calcium salts is one way to influence your pH of the product. And calcium also promotes true fermentation in the kettle. Low calcium can lead to oxalate crystals in beer. Who's ever seen this? It's gushing. If you open a bottle of beer and the beer comes squirting out the top of it, it can be because the beer is overcarbonated or infected or needing ferment. But additionally, calcium, not having enough calcium can lead to precipitated oxalate crystals, which are little pretty little diamonds you see in a microscope, and they make bubbles come out of beer very quickly. So typically you'll see 50 to 100 parts per million be an adequate number. And then for flocculation, at least 50 parts per million. So we commonly supplement calcium with calcium chloride and calcium sulfate. If we do water treatment like that, see those chemicals. So here's a photo of calcium oxalate crystals. These beautiful diamond crystals sit at the bottom of a beer bottle. And when you open that beer bottle, it makes it's like sprinkling sand or salt in your beer. It makes all the foam come out very quickly. This was somebody I did some work with a few years back. They were using a certain spice in their product that was higher in oxalate. That brought extra oxalate that needed a bigger dose of calcium to clear it out. They couldn't figure out why every time they made this beer, the beer was gushing out the top. It's a nucleation site where bubbles break out. It's pretty remarkable how quickly it comes out. It makes a big mess. Copper is an essential element for all forms of life. It's a cofactor in a lot of enzymes. It's helpful for yeast to make its enzymes. It uses its life cycle. And copper does reduce sulfur compounds. Reduces hydrogen sulfide, so it breaks that out, or removes that in the process. Too much copper can have a negative impact on your beer. Copper is a metal, and it can actually facilitate Haber-Weiss reactions, create reactive oxygen species. It'll break water down in your beer and release oxygen, which will oxidize your beer. So too much of this will actually oxidize your beer even after it's packaged. And that copper will go on and continue to repeat this reaction over and over and keep stealing your beer. Copper's pretty good though. It's a nutrient for the yeast. Yeast is pretty good at taking this out of your process. It does a good job knocking it out. There's a lot of old breweries, old European breweries, and a few large breweries in the US where they took old copper kettles out of their process and replaced them with stainless steel, and they saw a flavor shift in the product, and a lot of that was because of sulfur compounds. And in the world of distilling, we use copper for stills because it reduces sulfur as well. So high levels of copper are toxic to yeast, about 10 parts per million. Generally, copper coming in contact with wort is okay. Wort's got a higher pH. It's not as acidic, not as reactive as beer. Beer will dissolve copper very quickly and cause problems. So typically, we want to see less than 25, 0.25 parts per million. Iron, as brewers generally want to keep iron out of our process. It does exist. It is in our water. It's in our raw materials in trace amounts. Actually, yeast use it to help DNA replication, respiration, and synthesis of lipids for cell walls. Too much of it can inhibit saccharification, making starch into sugar, which is kind of important in our mashing process. Unpleasant at low levels. Has anybody tried beer with too much iron in it? That's got a metallic taste, kind of tastes like you dip your tongue and you're bleeding.
Also makes it salty.
It does have a salty character.
Doesn't iron also, is that a cause for gushing perhaps?
It does a lot with oxidation. It promotes Fenton's reaction. So another reactive oxygen species actually break oxygen out and repeat oxidation. I'm not familiar with it with gushing, but it's possible. It's not cleaned up well by yeast. So if you use a copper kettle, yeast will take that copper from the kettle and use that up in its life cycle. Yeast will not do the same with iron. And typically below 0.2 parts per million, 200 ppb, it will cause issues. Commonly contributed by water. Iron is often found in mineral deposits, like minerals like filter powder, but not uncommon to see that. So when you buy filter powder, like I said, look for low beer soluble iron grade product. And then, our tanks are made out of stainless steel. Stainless steel is wonderful. It doesn't react unless it's not welded properly. So this is a project I did a couple of years ago at a brewery. We had a lot of welds that didn't look so good from the outside. We even caught people that did the welds that didn't do such a great job spray painting them with silver paint so they look better. Oops. So we used this test here. We used a peroxyl agent. Basically, we created this solution that would dissolve iron out of the welds if it was available and turn dark blue. Yes?
Did you find that in welding that's commonly used in like brewery applications, or was there some sort of,
This was at a brewery.
oh, do they use some bullshit, or it's just from standard industry?
They weren't purging the welds properly on the inside or outside.
So they offered like some hack job bullshit?
The maintenance manager decided that purging wasn't necessary. It really didn't help anything.
Actually, some hack job bullshit.
So I bought him a purge meter, we had it on top.
So, Rich, how common do you think that is nowadays?
Very. These are pretty egregious looking welds. These are the worst I've found in the last 30 years of my career. You can see they're kind of bubbled up in here, and you can see the discoloration. But generally, if you've worked on the stainless steel and done any polishing or grinding or welding, you're removing the passive layer, and that needs to be cleaned up. So typically stainless steel is a crystal structure of chrome and oxygen. You want to remove the free iron from that. One of the ways to do that is doing a good acid wash. You know, the old traditional method was to use a very strong oxidizing acid like nitric acid. But there's a great procedure. If you look up passivation in NASA, they have a passivation method, which is citric acid and water and a hair dry. So typically you use the citric acid to remove the free iron from the weld, and then allow that to air dry and allow that layer of passive chrome oxide to build up. So if you've got new tanks, so we're doing passivation, you've got to make sure you clean that tank first, make sure you remove any polishing residue, things like that, because that can prevent that surface from oxidizing. That's definitely worth doing. And then you can do this peroxyl test. If you email me anything this, I can probably find the recipe for this. It was just nitric acid and an indicating dye. So it will stay nice and yellow if it was a passive well, but as soon as you touch it, something that is leaching free iron, it will show up as blue like that, the cotton swabs here. Pretty easy to figure out. Or just clean your tanks well and passivate before you clean the surface.
I've heard of all sorts of things about this. How often should you be passivating a tank?
Yeah, I see. I've seen that a lot. We passivate every 3 months, and we passivate once a year. And as long as your stainless is clean and cared for properly, it'll stay passive.
Okay.
As long as you don't disturb the surface, you should be fine. You know, if you're using something that can penetrate that and react with it, like chlorine, when you break a passive layer, you probably need to do it a little more often. But as long as you're using chemicals that are stainless steel safe and not disturbing the surface, you should be fine. You know, you'll see non-passive stainless, with free iron here, that'll rust. You'll see it turn red, rusty. So it's a good indication. At that point, you may need to do some stock cleaning and passivation. You know, the old technology you see in welding was pickling paste. Welders would complete a weld and they'd rub this paste on it and let it sit. And you'd have to go back and clean it after the fact. It was called pickling paste. It was like hydrofluoric nitric acid gel. Absolutely terrible for the environment, terrible for you if they're in contact with you. These days we really don't do that. But the citric acid method, that's the NASA method, is actually pretty darn good. And citric acid is pretty brewer friendly. Next up, magnesium. Magnesium is important to yeast health. It's a cofactor in about 300 enzymes inside yeast. It increases fermentation rate and it increases the rate of maltose take-up. This is very helpful for high gravity beers. If you're having beers that are struggling with attenuation in high gravity situations, this will definitely help filtration and cream. You want to have a minimum of about 40 parts per million of magnesium. A 10 plate of all malt wort is going to bring about 70 parts per million. So malt usually has enough of this, it's not a problem. High gravity is where you see it. You can add this, you can supplement this with magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts. Too much can have a negative impact on flavor, it can become astringent, kind of harsh. Too much, 125 parts per million, it becomes a laxative in your beer. That's not what you want to be known for. So typically in brewing water, we'll use 0 to 50 parts per million. Magnesium also lowers the pH. You can actually plug this into brewing water and see how it impacts your water chemistry, but it will lower your pH of it as well. It reduces yeast stress for ethanol, high gravity, highest amount of pressure, and help with poor nutrition and even temperature stress. So it's an important cofactor in glycolysis, and that's how yeast gets its energy. That's important. Manganese. Manganese promotes air scaling in similar fraction to iron and copper with an oxidation reaction. We don't want to see this. I've seen this in well water in New York pretty commonly. I think where I grew up, we had a fair amount of it. It enhances soluble protein at certain levels, but you don't want to see it in finished beer. There is manganese in malt, and you'll see it in hops as well, but typically it's taken out in the boiling process in crude. Dry hopping will contribute some manganese to your beer as well. So everything's compromised. Potassium, there are trace amounts contributed by malt. Over 10 parts per million can interfere with MASH enzymes, not a good situation. Potassium carbonate is used in winemaking to balance acidity. It tends to neutralize the acidity, carbonate in particular. We don't need to do that. We don't want that much potassium in our beer. That actually cause problems for us. Sodium, this is another metallic flavor. Sour, salty. It can actually help accentuate some beer flavor in trace amounts. Over 150 parts per million, they'll start to taste metallic. Apparently, want to limit levels to 100 parts per million. It can be toxic to yeast in high levels. People use this as an ingredient as part of the flavor profile in German sour wheat beer, goes beer. So typically, that beer you want this flavor in your beer. One of the watch-outs I've seen, people will run their beer through a water softener, or whether they'll run their water through a water softener if they've got high levels of calcium. What a lot of water softeners do is they'll replace calcium with sodium. So your water always softened, it's all good to go. Well, you actually put so much sodium in there, it's a flavor profile at this point. So you can make sure you're not doing too much replacement, too much softening with sodium, because it can actually carry over and change the flavor of your beer. And then there's one place I did some work with a few years back that the people in the town complained about the water. Not that the town softened all their water. They had about 250 parts per million sodium in their water out of the tap. So the breweries said, what do we do? So they had to reverse osmosis some of their water to reduce that down to an acceptable level. It was unfortunately very expensive. Zinc. I think a few people in this room I've talked to about zinc over the years. Zinc is an important cofactor in a whole bunch of enzymes, including ethanol dehydrogenase, helps keep yeast alive in the presence of alcohol. Yeast is magic. It does all sorts of good things. It increases fermentation rate and ester production. It helps stimulate the uptake of maltose. It's important for making cell membranes. And it's very, very important for yeast flocculation. If you're struggling with yeast not dropping out after fermentation, you might want to look at zinc. Brewers wort, an all malt wort brings all the nutrition you need to make beer, except for one thing, and that's zinc. There's not enough zinc in wort without supplementing. So the amount of yeast that you need depends on the yeast strain, and unfortunately it can vary by crop year and base malt, and it's easily lost in trub. So in boiling, you're going to create all that trub, you're going to lose a fair amount of zinc. Zinc is pretty unique though. It is antibacterial. It keeps bad things from growing. Then we open a brand new Band-Aid, ever notice that unique smell? That's zinc. They treat bandages with it because it's antibacterial. So you can make up zinc solution ahead of time, and it'll be shelf stable. So you can do that plenty of times. And you can actually add this with your yeast when you pitch. You don't want to add it to the yeast, but when you have cooled wort, you can actually add zinc at that point. So you're not going to realize those true losses, so you know exactly how much you're adding. If you add it in your kettle, you're going to lose probably 2/3 of it, maybe 3/4 of it. It varies based on crop year, how much protein, how much settling out you're doing. There's a guy I used to work with, Joe Kenny at Matt Brewing Company. He did a great research project on zinc. It is available on the Master Brewers website. And you can download it as a free episode from a few years ago, their podcast on how to use zinc. I know some vendors who sell zinc supplements, actually have a copy, and have Joe's paper available online, but it's very, very important trace nutrient. Level of zinc has a huge impact on yeast health, better flocculation, lower beer solids, easier clarification, more consistent fermentation. There's a downside to zinc though, too much of it will turn your yeast to peanut butter. What that means is the bottom of your tank will become so thick that you can't dump the yeast out of the bottom of the tank. At one point I worked at a brewery where we bottom crop yeast out of tanks. They actually send somebody in the tank and sweep the yeast out of the tank with a squeegee. Send somebody in there to get that stuff out, it's like heavy wet cement. They were unable to get that, so we had to back the yeast contributions off there. So zinc is somewhat cumulative, so as you dose zinc in your process, yeast will pick it up. The yeast will reproduce and spread that zinc over the new cells. So it may take a couple of generations to realize the full potential, and you have to adjust at that point if your yeast is too flooded and not flooding enough. It is an important trace nutrient that there's definitely not enough of. So typically L strains need a bit more than lager strains genetically, but each one's a little bit different. But this can really change your world and help fermentation go faster and help your beer clear up quicker. So as with many things in brewing, balance is key, and more of some things is not always better. So some of these things that will help your yeast, help your fermentation, help your yeast health, can cause problems if you're using too much. So start slow and build your way up. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Rich?
This might have been a myth, but I was told that by Zoran Hexagon, old school German brewers, instead of adding zinc, of course, would weld some sort of zinc plate to their kettle. Is that true, or is that just a rumor?
I used to work for a company that was stricter in Hexagon, and there was a big zinc bar in the bottom of everybody's grants.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
All right. True story.
Yeah, they take a big hunk of zinc bar and put it right in the ground to overflow over and dissolve it, so we just stayed there the whole time.
How would you replace the zinc bar?
It would last years.
Okay.
And we're talking, fractions of parts per million. But the problem with that was we were adding that to wort. When it goes to boil, we lose some, maybe a lot, maybe not so much.
So you're saying add it to the chiller?
If you make up a zinc solution, you can add it to the chilled wort. It's much better.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, so you make up a zinc sulfate solution in water, which is shelf stable, it's antibacterial. You can dose it in cooled wort and get a consistent dose every time. If you rely on the dose in the kettle, you're just going to lose some, a little bit or a lot to prove you don't know what that is.
Now, would you use that in addition to like a yeast nutrient or a replacement, or is yeast nutrient essentially the first nothing zinc anyway?
So Joe, who used to work for me, did this project on zinc a while ago, and people who sell yeast nutrient don't like it. So simply the person tell you that most of yeast nutrient was junk. We were really only one of the zinc of it. So he doesn't get Christmas cards from certain people.
There should be a wide range for how much zinc you're looking for, like what sort of range you're looking at. Okay.
So L strains are about 150 to 300 ppb. Lager strains are about 50 to 150 ppb. And it does vary by strain, depends on what nutrients you're using in the malt product.
Very nice.
Yes, a similar question. Do you know if most common yeast nutrients blends products contain zinc?
They do.
They do.
Yes. And there are some yeast nutrients that are Hexagon friendly. They're dead dried yeast that ate a whole lot of zinc before it was killed.
Use a zinc solution SOP.
Send me an email.
How the heck did you get that email, by the way? That's it.
I've been doing this for 32 years. Yeah, you wind up with gray hair and a cool email for 32 years.
I've got a pH question. So in the earlier part of your talk, you were talking about pH role in oxidation, and totally believe it, but I've also seen just anecdotally myself that when we dry hop sour beer, the hop character lasts for years.
Well, the beers at a higher pH, the non-sour beers, were more prone to oxidation, so the sour beers would be less prone.
Okay, so, all right, so we confirm. Is that, I think it's a bit other way.
I'm sorry, but the higher pH is more prone to oxidation, but you'll get more desirable hop aromatics. So everything you do is a trade-off, man. Everything you do, you're solving one problem, you're creating other. Welcome to brewing.
Rich, you had mentioned about the change in flavor profile, moving from a copper kettle to a stainless steel kettle. I've heard stories of people hanging copper pipe in their kettle. Is that?
I may or may not have done that in my career. I know a lot of the old brewers that would, when they switched to copper kettles, would save a piece of the old kettle and actually let that climb around the bottom of their stainless steel kettle to maintain consistency. Any other questions?
How would you measure zinc parts per million, parts per billion? Is that, you would have to send that out to get tested, or are you just, before you add it, you're measuring what you're adding in a certain?
I would probably start, if I were starting from scratch, I'd probably start at a low dose and see how it impacts your beer, and your observation of that yeast health and yeast behavior would be your indicator. You can send it out for atomic absorption spectrophotometry to an outside lab. There are labs that do that. I don't know of any locally that do that, but that they would give you an accurate zinc number. But you can solve that yourself just by observing your yeast and looking how things flocculate and chart your fermentation.
Yeah, so you just kind of measure an amount and assume I'm adding this many parts per billion. And that's
Well, you can, yeah, if you make up your zinc solution, you can calculate the molecular mass of zinc and the contribution in parts per million by weight.
Did you employ sedimentation companies?
We used to take wort with yeast and dose different levels of zinc in it in graduating numbers, and we'd actually see how that yeast would settle over time. And we'd use that for starting, and then we'd start to put that in production at the levels that we saw with the best result. And if you look up Joe's paper, look up Joe Kinney and zinc on the internet, it'll show up. He's done a great job with it. It was a side project we did many years ago.
Any, just real quick, in regards to observation, is there like any sort of implementation or routine that you would recommend for activating things? Or
I think that the NASA citric acid method, if you Google that, that'll come right up. I think that's a really great place to start. Yeah.
We go with that UDS, their oxystrike, their acid really passivation chemical, so it actually repassivates a small layer and it's rather yeah, it's the two of them, it's the acid and passivation.
So Rich, New Brewer had one of 4 or 5 years back in an article that their passivation steps were phosnitric blend, no rinse, non-caustic alkaline clear, aka PBW, and then rinse heavy. And I checked with manufacturers, and they've said that's also equally as good as doing the NASA way.
Yeah, there's a lot of recipes for it. I think the PBW method, I think they say builds a little bit better.
That's, yeah, that was the thing, yeah, it's a thicker layer.
Yeah, I mean, the citric acid is a simple one step, that's why I like it. And
Yeah.
it's pretty brewer friendly. It's not, it doesn't eat you, it just eats the iron off the table.
I like it. It's easier to say or chew.
It's easier to get your hands on the table.
I'm just curious if you had any tips, like how would you ascertain the mineral contribution of your ingredients? Like how might you estimate what's being contributed there?
A lot of them are raw materials and they vary each year. Just the ones that you can control easily, look, your water is a huge contributor. Look at your process to make sure your tanks are passive. Look at your suppliers, and you get analysis on beer soluble iron, things like that. The big one for yeast health was zinc. You can send stuff out, and if you start to see problems, you can send word out and get tests, but it can be kind of pricey. But the basics, if you know what to look out for, you can say, well, thanks, my pipe's rusting, or we switched malt and now our yeast doesn't flocculate. Those are kind of clues to point you in some directions. So, you can send stuff out and do AA analysis, but for the most part, you can solve all these with a little bit of deduction.
How many times in the calendar year would you suggest testing well water for a lot of these trace minerals?
How deep is your well? Does your water taste different from summer to winter?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, I would probably.
Anytime you notice the flavor change?
Yeah, I'd say, okay, the summer water tastes different. Well, then, what's going on? You figure out when those shifts are. If you have a drought year, I would probably be, your indicator. There's a woman I work with here, Laura. She brewed for me for a number of years, and she would check our pH of her mash every brew. And she would make adjustments on the fly. She'd say, put 80% of the expected dose of acid into our mash, check it. If she didn't get the results she wanted, she'd fine tune that. And we saw our water shift, and she came to me and said, we're actually getting more than we expected, and we use that to identify our shift. So, look at your mash will tell you what's going on. If you're not getting the expected result, maybe one of your things needs to be tested. But yeah, I know when I was in Michigan years ago, we had our water came from Lake Michigan, and the fall, the water would stink when the lake would turn, and we'd see a shift in our pH. The hot and cold waters would switch seasonally as the weather changed, and we'd see a shift in our water, a shift in the flavor. We'd change some of the water chemistry and the water chemistry, but the big indicator was really our mash pH.
You had mentioned, Rich, that there's an effect of copper on sulfur compounds. Any effect on DMS precursors or DMS formation?
Don't know. The DMS is such a volatile, it doesn't make it through the kettle anyway. And you do see DMS from bacterial contributions.
When we count cells at least, we occasionally see like those little diamond crystals that are roughly the size, maybe a little bit bigger than what we expect for yeast cells. Like, is that probably calcium oxalate? And then
It could be. Usually we see it smaller than cells, but if your crystals have time to develop, I'd take a look at your incoming water, what's your calcium contribution. Are you getting it at least 50 parts per million? And if you're seeing it, is it in certain beers? I know that the pictures I had working in a brewery, they're using a certain spice that brought a lot of oxalate with it. So, if you ideally, those oxalate crystals do precipitate in with your yeast and your brewing process. That means you're getting rid of it. It's not making it to your finished bottles and cans, so that's not a bad thing. But it's like a needle in a haystack in refinement. Impressive.
Do you have any questions for Rich?
Thank you
Okay,
guys.
thank you, Rich.